In 1892, Ellis Island began receiving immigrants to the United States. The author J.R.R. Tolkien was born, and Grover Cleveland is elected to a second non-consecutive term to be president of the United States. And Boise, Idaho began tapping into geothermal energy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the Heat Beneath Our Feet webinar, a webinar series that will accompany this year's WGA Chairman Initiative selected by Colorado Governor Jared Polis to explore the development and deployment of geothermal energy. I'd like to take this time to extend a thank you to Governor Brad Little of Idaho for inviting us and the rest of the crew out to Idaho's geothermal resources. On October 24th, WGA had the opportunity to tour Boise's geothermal district heating system and host a workshop to discuss the challenges with the development and deployment of geothermal resources. Governor Little pointed out that the geothermal resources used today had long been recognized for their heat even prior to 1892, as indigenous tribes had long used the area for winter camps. On today's webinar, you'll get to hear more about the potential for development of geothermal resources in Idaho, get a peek into BLM's permitting process for geothermal projects, and receive an overview of the City of Boise's geothermal heating district. I'd like to extend a thank you to the City of Boise who made our tour possible, as well as the many individuals who took time out of their schedule from the federal and state governments, academia, as well as the private sector to participate in our workshop. And before going any further, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors who are listed at the beginning of this webinar and at the end. Their support is making our work on this initiative possible. Today, we're joined by three experts in their respective fields. First, we have Lorenzo Trimble, the geothermal program lead for the Bureau of Land Management. We also have joining us Claudio Berti, the state geologist and director of Idaho Geological Survey. And finally, we're joined by John Gunnarsson, the geothermal coordinator for the City of Boise. Throughout this webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please submit them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentations. To kick off this discussion, I'd like to hand the mic over to John Gunnarsson, the geothermal coordinator for the City of Boise, to give us an overview of Boise's geothermal heating district. John, I heard when I was out there that it is the biggest and oldest geothermal heating district in the nation. Is that true? And what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, hey, Stephen, thanks for having me. Yes, so we are the largest geothermal heating district in our country, in the United States, and here in Boise, we also have the largest geothermal heating district. Just jumping right into it, in fact, there's a lot of history that Boise has with geothermal use, from, as we mentioned, the world's first geothermal heating district built in the late 1890s, to some of the world's first greenhouses to be heated by geothermal water in the early 1900s. Much of Boise's success is attributed to geothermal resource availability here in the valley. But then we fast forward a little bit, and today, most all of the larger buildings in downtown Boise are heated by this natural geothermal resource. What I have on my screen here is a map of downtown Boise. And what we're looking at are there's actually 4 separate geothermal heating districts that are in operation today. So downtown Boise, this is the Boise River going right through downtown. This green line here, this is that historic Boise Warm Springs Water District, again developed in the late 1800s. Serves about 350 homes. This system is still in operation today. But then we fast forward to the 1970s, and 3 other districts were formed. The state of Idaho drilled their own production injection well, and we have the only state capitol and the Capitol Mall heated by geothermal. At the same time, the feds drilled geothermal wells, and we have the only VA hospital and about 22 buildings on their VA campus to be heated by geothermal. And then this third system, this pink, this magenta system, is the City of Boise system. This is the system that I operate. And this is the largest in our country. We are serving just shy of 100 buildings now. That equates to about 6.5 million square feet. And just to give a little overview, we have 3 production wells at the top end of our system. We're piping this hot water to buildings throughout downtown. And then we collect this water again and we re-inject it into our injection well. On the other side of the Boise River here, this is Boise State University, and we are now serving 11 buildings over on Boise State's campus. So the way our system operates is we pump natural 177 F water out of the ground and we deliver it to buildings. Buildings are receiving this water in temperatures about 160 to 175. Buildings extract heat out of this water and then we collect it again. So when we were looking at that map, everywhere that you saw one of our lines, it's actually 2 pipes. It's a 2-pipe system. The supply water going to buildings, the collection water taking it from the buildings to go get re-injected again. Because of this 2-pipe system, it is a closed system. So no water is being stored, no water is coming out of the faucets. In essence, we're selling the heat from the water to these buildings. Now, also just to be clear, this is considered low temperature geothermal. So again, this water is about 177 F, which is not hot enough for standard power production per the typical way of producing power with geothermal water. This is for direct use applications only. So this is for heating buildings or heating sidewalks or heating domestic water. Again, we pump the water out of the ground, serve downtown Boise, and we re-inject this water right back into the aquifer. Last year in water year 22, this is a graph, this is our fiscal year, October through September. This is showing my production rates, and you'll see most of the water that we do produce is in these cold winter months, the November through April months. But it is a year-round utility. We're serving geothermal water year-round. And the reason for this is what this water is now being used for. Originally, it was developed for providing heat to these buildings. Well, now buildings are also taking this water and heating their domestic water within the buildings. So they're not using the geothermal water to come out of the showers, but they're heating all the water within these buildings. There's a handful of swimming pools in downtown Boise that are heated by it, laundry facilities at many of the hotels, a handful of sidewalk snowmelt systems, and then a handful of other miscellaneous direct use applications. Since the early 1980s, we have seen pretty steady system growth. Looking at this graph, this is a few years dated, it appears, because we are now just under 100 buildings. But you can see over the course of the last 40 years, it has been very steady growth on our system. If you're familiar with Boise or you visit Boise, most all of the large downtown buildings are heated by geothermal water. Now, like any utility, there are challenges associated with managing this. We've got 3 larger challenges that we've been working on. Number one, looking at this graph, is the comparison to natural gas rates. So buildings, they have choices on how they want to heat their building. And historically, we carried, looking at this graph, the blue lines represent our geothermal rates. The orange line represents natural gas rates. We carried a 30% cost savings to use geothermal to be the cheaper way to heat a building compared to natural gas. And that carried true all the way through the mid-2000s until natural gas started getting cheaper and cheaper as more of it was being developed. And well, as natural gas rates went down, we could not compete with natural gas rates. And so there was that delta, that difference of natural gas being a cheaper utility, which made it tough for geothermal to compete with. Similar, kind of going down the same avenue, is the awareness of what geothermal energy is. Geothermal energy, it's really a niche that a lot of communities and developers are not familiar with. So as new buildings are being designed and being built, often geothermal is not being considered. If it is being considered, sometimes it's at the very last minute. And at this point, the building has already been designed and they already know their utility loads. And so growing more awareness around this natural resource could definitely benefit more growth in use of this utility. And then of course, there's a material selection aspect of it, with not many examples to follow from. This is a utility that has a very high rate of corrosion, and we're just looking at different materials, different technologies to just stay ahead of it and try to prevent any kind of failures of the system that could be happening sooner or later. So what are we doing? Where are we going with our utility here in Boise? Well, already being the largest in the nation, we want to continue to do what we're doing. We're going to keep growing our system. We're going to be infilling our system. We're expanding it. But we're also doing some other fun things out there, rather than just a space heating utility. We do have a grant application in right now to do a study to do a combined heating and cooling district. So these 100 buildings downtown can have an option for their cooling as well. We're looking at showcasing geothermal here in Boise via some sort of demonstration project. That may also include some sort of hot springs or some kind of recreational activity. Educating developers and building owners prior to design, and the list goes on. There's a lot we're doing to really mature and advance the geothermal utility here in Boise. Something else that we're very proud of is not only are we providing this geothermal resource to buildings downtown, but we're also talking about it. We've worked with the Boise State University, the city's public arts program, and we've incorporated a handful of different public art pieces that incorporate geothermal in one aspect or another. We host a watershed education center that also focuses highly on the geothermal resource here in the valley and what it means to us and what it means to future generations. We also were constantly hosting other communities, other countries, other cities who want to develop a similar utility. And then a handful of different geothermal working groups across the nation, across the world that we're associated with. So why geothermal? Well, it is truly a clean, carbon-free energy. It is, in the utmost regards, renewable and sustainable. We don't need the sun to be shining. We don't need the wind to be blowing for this energy to be provided. It's a local energy, so we're not relying on outside states or outside countries. We dictate our pricing on it, and we have very stable pricing, much stabler than the oil and gas industries, which really helps people budget long-term energy costs. And of course, there's a handful of different climate and energy goals that our community is trying to achieve, and geothermal checks a lot of those boxes. Just for reference, here this last water year, for water year 22, just our system alone, not including the Warm Springs, the state of Idaho, or the VA system, our system alone offset over 9,000 tons of carbon emissions, equivalent to basically removing about 20 million miles off the road. And with that, I will stop sharing, and I'll be available for any questions at the end.
John, thank you very much. I think something really cool that the city of Boise is the promotion of those plaques. One thing that's been coming up during this initiative is the education part about geothermal resources. So it's really cool that you're putting the geothermal heating district plaques on the buildings that it's actually heating and is using that resource. So I think that's a really cool thing you guys have going.
No, thank you. Yeah, those plaques have been a huge success. We initially developed those for our internal purposes to get the message out, to share the message that geothermal water is being used in downtown Boise. But we found out immediately that buildings like to have these plaques on their building as well to help showcase to their tenants and to their to their businesses and people who come into their businesses. These buildings are being heated by a renewable resource, and we're seeing more hotels, we're seeing more businesses that are wanting to connect onto this geothermal utility just for that sustainability aspect there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, John, and we'll head on to our next guest on today's webinar, Claudio Berti. He is the director and state geologist for the Idaho Geological Survey. And something I was surprised to find out is the potential for geothermal resources in Idaho is awesome. Could you tell us some more about that, Claudio?
Certainly, Stephen, thank you very much. And hopefully you guys can hear me fine. Yeah, I would like to thank you, the Western Governor Association, for the opportunity of presenting, and I'll take a second here to sit on this intro slide just to give an idea of the complexity and the multiple aspect of what we call geothermal. And I'll try to present something has the potential of what we have geothermally in Idaho, but also really what is the reality of what we already are doing. And John gave just a wonderful introduction of how the city of Boise is leveraging on this renewable resource in a very smart way and fruitful way. So here we have a very kind of busy slide with a few things that are related to geothermal. When we think about geothermal, we mostly think about energy production, a geothermal power plant to produce electricity, but really geothermal is a sort of a catch-all term to include many aspects of a resource that is provided by our Earth and is completely renewable, and it's definitely something that can be leveraged in multiple ways, as we do in Idaho. So here we have the power plant that we have in Idaho. It's the Rough River down in kind of south central Idaho. Is the only operating power plant in Idaho so far. Then we also have actually a picture of the historic well building for the Warm Spring district in the city of Boise, and a couple of other instrumentation related to that. But we also have what is kind of related to geothermal has recreation and tourism, and also application in industry at large, in direct use, like in this case is the fish production, but also is used in greenhouses, etc. Here we go. So just very quickly, like geothermal energy is the art, if you want, or the science of harnessing the power and the heat that comes from the interior of the Earth for many different processes. This is a map of the world at large, and in red we have areas where we recognize and we measure a strong heat flow through the different continents. And of course, while we like to think that geothermal is a widespread, omnipresent power, which is true in some sort of respect, there are definitely areas of the world that are more subject or more favorable to that. And the United States is definitely kind of split in half, you know, with the eastern side with a low geothermal flux, but the western states with a very, very high geothermal flux. And this map is produced by the Southern Methodist University, commissioned by the Department of Energy, and reflects the amount of heat that comes from the interior of the Earth. And the warm color, of course, symbolize much strong heat. And if you take a look at Idaho, we certainly sit on some sort of a soft spot, a sweet spot, and we are kind of in the wake of the largest geophysical or thermal anomaly in North America, which is Yellowstone, which happens to be a combination of geothermal and wonderful landscape. But for the rest of Idaho, there is definitely the warm color are predominantly in respect of the cold color, which means that there is a lot of potential for developing geothermal in Idaho. Also like to make a little bit of a kind of an overview of what really is geothermal and how we use it. John made a kind of a hint of the fact that Boise is harnessing what is kind of a low temperature geothermal, and there are different degrees of the fluids that we can access, and according to the temperature that we can tap into, we can have different uses. Idaho has uses for everything from low temperature to mid-temperature geothermal, and is used by district heating, geothermal heat pumps, fish farming, greenhouses, up to binary geothermal power plants in the Raft River. Also, the geothermal is kind of seeing a very strong renewal in their technology, and what has been the classic system of an hydrothermal system, which really kind of implies some sort of a reservoir and fluids and the ability of tapping into that and bringing that to the surface and use them through a power plant or so. There are new development that seems to allow customer to really reach into a number of application that makes geothermal quite palatable. So this is a classic scheme for a hydrothermal system. It's kind of what is currently used in energy production. And really what we need is we need a heat source, we need fluids or steam, and then we need some sort of a plumbing system, which has to be already naturally developed. So we need permeability, we need connectivity, we need this heat to be transported from the depth of the crust or the earth up to the surface through some sort of a circulation of hydrothermal fluids. And so this is kind of the classic scheme. Those are something like the Raft River is one of the example, Yellowstone Large is one of the example, and so on. These systems are widespread. We know them, and they are definitely used and developed in many parts of the state. In Idaho has much of the western states. So here's a map of the general picture of installed and under development geothermal capability per state. And the numbers are expressed in megawatts for power. So you see that Idaho, it doesn't necessarily raise among the strongest production. Here, the big player is definitely California, with a lot of installed production and capability, and also a lot of planned and underdeveloped capabilities, followed by Nevada. But Nevada is really kind of our neighbor to the south, and so there is something of this area that is favorable, and Idaho is kind of racing to better understand the system and capitalize on it. So here again is a map of the United States, and again maybe pay attention or focus on Idaho for this particular webinar. The dots are identified hydrothermal sites. That means there are places where the water comes to the surface at a high temperature. This is in 90 degrees Celsius. This is close to boiling, I would say. And the red color are areas of favorable potential for new development of geothermal. Those are called enhanced geothermal system, which is basically a new way of looking at geothermal, where we may be missing some of the component of the ideal geothermal plumbing system. I was mentioning we need heat, we need water, we need conductivity. The enhanced geothermal system is a development that try to somehow engineer the reservoir and create the conductivity where the conductivity doesn't exist in those rocks. So there is some sort of way to, with techniques that are actually inherited by the oil industry, to enhance the reservoir and augment the fractures, and then eventually even pumping the water into those reservoirs to really capture the heat. So here's a snapshot of really what we know and what we have in Idaho. On the left is a map of the hydrothermal spring, so evidence at the surface. Those drops are color-coded by temperature in degrees, in degrees Celsius at the surface, between pretty much cold water between 20 and 35 degrees Celsius up to over 80 extremely hot temperature. And then we have a map of the permitted ground wells that also have some geothermal evidence. And again, color-coded by low temperature up to very high temperature, 240 degrees, in this case, Fahrenheit, sorry for the confusion here. But anyway, very high temperature. And if I can point very quickly to some anomalies here, where we have the Snake River Plain, we have very little data and we have very little information. But on the other side, this area is the one that we assume to be more favorable, has potential for heat. And so the question is, what is going on and why don't we see that? Well, that's because there is some geological phenomenon that somehow caps and masks the possible flow of and presence of heat at the surface, at depth. So one challenge for Idaho right now is definitely find ways to better understand those systems, which are not classic, and we call them hidden geothermal system, and how to capitalize on that. There have been a number of studies. Certainly, we need to learn more about the fracture, about the piping system. This is an example of what we knew before 2020 about fracture. This is in the area of Bear Lake and China Hat. And after 2020, what we, with the survey, have been performing work at this to better understand this fracture. You can see that the amount of rupture that can be favorable is definitely increased exponentially. Not because the fracture increased, because our understanding of that is increased. But we also need to understand how much those fractures are active today, how much this plumbing system is kept open by earthquake, for example, or motion. And we also need to understand how the different blocks of our state moves with respect to the other, to one another, to actually keep this plumbing system open. And so there are a few studies and that are trying to understand these unconventional geothermal resources. This is a study that is actually ongoing right now across the whole Great Basin that encompasses Utah and Nevada, California, part of Oregon, and the southern part of Idaho, south of the Snake River Plain, and is trying to analyze all the favorable aspect of a potential geothermal system where we are lacking just a superficial expression to find out whether there is something at the surface that can be tapped. There is a lot of challenges in that. We are working on it, and I'll leave it up for questions. Hopefully this is a good overview of what we can do. There's a lot of groups that are working on that. I didn't mention that, but there's a lot of research that is going on in this field.
Claudio, I think it is amazing what you do as a geologist. I know I have mentioned this to you, but if I could go back and do college again, I would want to become a geologist and do this type of science. No bias to the rest of the sciences. I just think it's amazing what you're able to do. Thank you very much for this overview. I think one topic that has come up is resource assessment is very important. And I just appreciate the work that you guys are doing, as well as the work that's going on with the USGS. So I'll pose a situation for our next guest, Lorenzo Trimble, who is the project lead at the geothermal project lead at Bureau of Land Management. Lorenzo, my question to you is, if I go into Claudio's data and I find a prime location, and it just so happens to be on a nice square of BLM land, what does that process look like for me to start my geothermal project?
All right, well, thanks for that question. Let me first start here talking about our authorities and where we at the BLM derive our authorities. And so you can see a list of acts here: the Mineral Leasing Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Federal Land Policy and Management Act, as well as the Geothermal Steam Act, which is really important for us in geothermal, and a 1988 amendment to the Geothermal Steam Act, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which also amended the Geothermal Steam Act, and the Energy Act of 2020 as well. Okay, is my screen gonna advance here? There we go. First, what we do is we, before we can do any leasing of geothermal, offer any geothermal leases, first we have to conduct what's called land use planning. It follows a similar process to oil and gas land use planning. It's required by the Federal Land Policy Management Act. During our land use planning effort, we are balancing resource use and protection. We're also working to resolve conflicts, resource conflicts, because we have all sorts of resources, not just geothermal. We have oil and gas, grazing, mining, and just a whole bunch of things. So we have to work to resolve all those resource conflicts. And during the land use planning process, that sets the basis for resource allocations, including geothermal. And so we identify those lands that are open to geothermal leasing or open with stipulations or closed to leasing. And then the Geothermal Steam Act, or sorry, the Geothermal Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement of 2008 amended 114 land use plans to incorporate geothermal leasing in the areas of those land use plans. It also improved leasing on BLM and Forest Service lands. It's still effective and not stale. Very good document for us. We rely on it all the time. Trying to advance my slides here. They seem to want to take a little time here. Let's see. Okay. So once we have land use plans in place for each of our districts, then we can start the geothermal leasing process. And so that's all in the past now. And so we are regular leasing for geothermal resources. And so again, that process is very similar to oil and gas. And what happens at first is somebody who's interested in leasing federal lands for geothermal development, what they do is submit a geothermal lease nomination with a filing fee. So there's a form that they fill out and they pay the filing fee that's outlined there, $120 plus 12 cents per acre. And those nominations are entered into our system called the National Fluids Lease Sale System. We check land status and prepare what's called a preliminary parcel list. That preliminary parcel list is then sent out to our district and field offices who conduct a lease parcel review, where they look to make sure that the lease parcel is within their land use plan, so it conforms with their land use plans. They conduct NEPA if necessary and apply stipulations to protect resources. They also consult with other surface management agencies, such as the Forest Service, if the nominated lands are on Forest Service lands. They engage stakeholders for public participation. They also, once all that's done, they prepare what's called a lease sale notice, and that gets posted along with the NEPA 45 days prior to a lease sale. During that time, that 45-day period, public can protest specific sale parcels. We work to resolve those protests and then hold the lease sale. After the lease sale, we then issue the leases, and I'll talk more about the lease sale itself on the next slide. Once leases are issued, they have a rental rate for competitive leases of $2 an acre for the first year, $3 an acre for the years 2 through 10. And for non-competitive acre leases, it's $1 per acre for years 1 through 10. And since the Energy Policy Act of 2005, royalty rates are now set at 1.75% for the first 10 years of electrical of generation, and then 3.5% after that. Our geothermal lease sales are competitive lease auctions. They're internet-based, so similar to eBay. They're hosted by a company called EnergyNet. Bidding starts at $2 per acre, and the highest bid wins. Those nominated land parcels that were offered at a competitive lease sale that received no bids are then available for non-competitive leasing. First, on a day on the day after sale, and if we receive multiple offers for a specific parcel, we choose the parcel by draw. And then after that, it's on a first come, first served basis for 2 years following the lease sale. The lease terms are, there's a primary term of 10 years. They are eligible for an initial extension of 5 years and an additional extension of another 5 years, unless they reach production, and then the lease is held by production. The maximum size of a lease is 5,120 acres. And the lessee has the exclusive right to develop geothermal resources. And they pay annual rentals until production, and then they pay royalties on that production. There's basically 3 phases of geothermal development, and our regulations follow that. Phase 1 being exploration, which is outlined in our 43 CFR 3250 regulations. And these can be approved as either casual use. We also have a categorical exclusion, a CX, that can be used to approve it, or in some cases, it may have to go through the NEPA process, and it could be would likely be an environmental assessment. Exploration includes geophysical exploration, including the drilling of temperature gradient wells. During the exploration phase, they are not allowed, they're just searching for the presence of a geothermal resource. So in the case of drilling temperature gradient wells, those are not allowed to be drilled into a resource, but instead to search for the presence of geothermal resources indirectly. And then phase 2 is what we call drilling operations. That's outlined in our 43 CFR 3260 regulations. And that is for drilling resource confirmation wells intended to drill into a resource. And a project proponent would submit what's called an operations plan, which outlines the surface disturbing activities where they would put well pads, access roads, and any ancillary facilities. And then that operations plan would go through a NEPA review, and that is typically an environmental assessment. And then once that EA is approved, then a geothermal drilling permits can be submitted and approved to allow for drilling wells for resource confirmation. If the project proponent confirms a commercial grade resource, they can then move to phase 3 by submitting a utilization plan. That is a plan that outlines where they would put power plants, transmission lines, pipelines, any additional well pads or roads, and they can also submit additional geothermal drilling permits. And then NEPA is required on that utilization plan, again, typically an EA. And our utilization operations are outlined in our regulations at 43 CFR 3270. Takeaway here is that currently getting a geothermal energy to market typically requires at least 2 NEPA decision points. So phase 2 and phase 3 are those 2 decision points that at least require NEPA at this point. Really quick, I'll go over our federal geothermal statistics. As of fiscal year 2021, we had 428 leases encompassing approximately 815,000 acres, 84 of which of those are in producing status, approximately 102,000 acres. We have 48 operating power plants in California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico. We have gross installed capacity, all these power plants of 2,500 megawatts. In fiscal year 2021, those power plants generated 9.8 million megawatt hours of electricity, which is enough to power approximately 1.3 million homes. Of these geothermal projects, that there is a total surface disturbance of approximately 2,430 acres. So doing a little math, dividing the 2,430 acres by the number of homes, we see that 535 homes are powered by 1 acre of surface disturbance associated with geothermal energy. So very small surface footprint for geothermal energy. From our fiscal year 2019 Department of Interior Economic Contributions report, our geothermal program contributed 6,900 jobs to the U.S. economy, as well as a $2.05 billion total economic contributions. The capacity factor of the power plants in our portfolio, that capacity factor is a ratio of actual time operating at capacity compared to the amount of potential time operating at capacity in a given period of time. That period of time is typically looked at over a course of a year. And in fiscal year 2020, the capacity factor of our power plants was about 73%, with an average operational uptime of 94% in fiscal year 2021 and over $18.5 million in revenue in fiscal year 2021. And that those dollars are dispersed per a formula set by the Energy Policy Act of 2005, where 50% is dispersed to the state, 25% to the respective county, and 25% remains at the U.S. Treasury. And that is reauthorized annually every year. And that's the presentation I wanted to go over.
Well, Lorenzo, thank you very much. And it's so nice to have that process put into something I can actually understand. So I appreciate you being on our webinar today. Now, a very interesting question that did pop up at our workshop was about the coexistence of oil and gas wells as well as geothermal wells together. Could you go over maybe some of the priorities you guys put on each other on geothermal wells and oil and gas wells, and can they coexist next to each other?
So the Energy Act of 2020 amended the Geothermal Steam Act to allow a lessee with a operating or with a producing oil and gas lease, so federal producing oil and gas lease that has a producible oil and gas well, to apply for non-competitively for a geothermal lease. And so we've actually had our first application of that in Nevada at the Blackburn field, where there is an oil and gas well, and the water that's being produced with the oil is warm enough and hot enough and of enough volume that they have had a little pilot project to generate electricity to help power operations on the lease. And we'll see what other proposals we see in the near future and how folks plan to use that.
That's really exciting to hear, and I'll make sure to look for updates on that. While we were going through our presentations, we did have a couple questions come in. One of them was, can you make these slides available? These webinars will be up on Western Governors Association's YouTube as well as social media within the day after this webinar. So make sure to check our YouTube page as well as social media channels, and you can find these presentations as well as the entire webinar there. Another question we had to come in was from Joseph Islis, and I believe this one's going to be for John. The question was, are there any applications combined with HVAC? John, could you go over how if I were a building and wanted to hook up to your system, how that might work, and does HVAC have a part in that?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So we are working closer with the ASHRAE, the HVAC professional organization, on different methods for incorporation. To answer the question, there's really not a one size fits all for all buildings. Buildings are designed differently and heat differently. Geothermal works in some applications, it doesn't work in others. So to connect onto a low temperature geothermal heating district, if the building can be designed for using this temperature of water, then there's practically little to no issues incorporating it. But now existing buildings to retrofit to geothermal, again, it really depends on how the original building was designed, what internal temperatures the building set to maintain, and whether or not 170-degree water is warm enough for that. For example, a lot of boilers inside of buildings, they're creating water inside of buildings in the upwards of 190-degree range. And our geothermal fluid temperatures will just never get it there. And so we have seen a couple of buildings that operate less than efficiently with the water. But on the flip side, if a building is designed around it and meant to use this temperature of water, then it is extremely efficient. It's economic savings to the building. It's environmental savings to our community. It's a win-win-win. Bless you.
Thank you. I apologize. I was trying to do that as subtly as possible. But thank you for that explanation. We also have a question from Eric Olson, and I think this will be for Lorenzo. What is the average permitting time for geothermal today? And has the rate changed, gotten slower, faster over time? And he also posed another question saying, does EGS pose increased permitting regulatory requirements on public lands? Curious about the number of or depth of NEPA reviews required for hydrothermal versus EGS?
So as far as an average permitting timeline, it's kind of hard to say. We have seen a project in recent years go from lease issuance to a producing power plant within under 4 years. However, that is not the norm. That's probably the best case scenario that we've seen. But it's probably about on the order of 5 or 6 years. There are some papers out there that do outline that. So you might look out and do some research for papers that outline that. We don't have any hard statistics to stand on ourselves. And then with regards to EGS, we would, a project proponent in their operations plan would want to make sure what their EGS proposal is, such as the volume of fluid to be injected, the time frame to inject that fluid, the pressure that they plan, and we would look to consider if there would be a potential for inducing seismicity, and if so, making sure that proper monitoring and for the inducing of seismicity, as well as making sure that we have proper like a red light, stop light, if things get out of control type scenario.
Wonderful. Now we've got our last question here, and I think I'll pass this one over to Claudio. Sarah has proposed that if she were making a geothermal mapping app and wanted to map out some ground temperatures up to the depth of 650 feet, what variables would be the most valuable to somebody making a geothermal project? What is somebody looking for at that type of depth, Claudio?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. And of course, the kind of estimating what's the temperature at depth is it's a hard task. And I was actually looking at that website that Sarah pointed to actually see what they're doing with their company, which is actually quite interesting and quite amazing. Certainly the best things to do is actually have some constraint in the temperature at depth, and so having deep well that allow you to estimate the temperature, it's fundamental. One of the maps that I was showing in my presentation for the Snake River Plain shows the density of data for example, in the Western Snake River Plain, because of the deep drilling for water and for oil and gas, as somebody mentioned, this kind of co-locating. There is a wealth of data that allow you to do prediction with the granularity of the data. It's more consistent as you move, for Idaho in particular, into the, let's say, into the central or eastern Snake River Plain. The amount of deep data definitely decreases, and so what we do is mostly kind of prediction and best guess, which are done with some algorithm of kringing of the data or so on, that allow you to fill the gap in between the few data points that you have in the best possible way. I would say that having as many temperature data as possible, having a good general regional setting for fault and fracture and the way that the water circulates, and so some kind of deep water model, deep aquifer model would be two points, two data set that I would definitely value for that kind of information.
Thank you, Claudio. Well, I don't want to hold our guests any further from the amazing jobs that they have. I'd like to thank all of our participants in today's webinar. And once again, thank you to Governor Brad Little for inviting WGA to Idaho to see their geothermal resources. As I mentioned prior to this, once this webinar ends, a recording of it will be up on our YouTube page as well as on our social media channels. So make sure to search Western Governors Association on YouTube, and you'll be able to find this in the next day. Join us next time, though, on the Heat Beneath Our Feet webinar, when we discuss funding opportunities for geothermal, enhanced geothermal systems, land access, and synergies with the oil and gas industry. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week.